Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. Thanks for listening today and trusting Grief Refuge as a resource to help navigate your grief. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Grief Refuge is about helping you find peace and purpose after loss. This podcast was created with the intention to help validate everything that you're going through, to take time to reflect, and to honor your loved one. Here at Grief Refuge, you will learn healthy ways to manage your grief. You can also find comfort, hopefulness, and gain a sense of peace in regards to your loss, as well as finding a way to embrace life and move forward. Through the stories and conversations shared on this podcast, my intention is to help you work through the heavier, more painful feelings that go hand in hand with grief. We both know that grief is hard and it is painful. I'm glad you're here, and I promise to do everything I can to provide the best support to you. Before we begin, there's just a little housekeeping to cover. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while listening. Rather, I invite you to use the time for your self-care and your personal reflection. Use this time to relax and to allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. Use this time to mourn your loss. Additionally, this podcast publishes episodes twice a month. When you're grieving, that's a lot of time in between each episode, and you may need more resources. Things can and often do come up, and you may feel setbacks, more confusion, overwhelm, and other strong emotions that feel more painful. If you're in a place of needing more support, download the Grief Refuge app. The Grief Refuge app, it's a hub for getting more support. On the Grief Refuge app, you can find stories, tips, and guidance for navigating your grief journey. You can also receive daily messages of validation, hope, and comfort to help soothe and comfort you throughout the difficult journey. You can find and download the Grief Refuge app from your phone's app store. Thank you. Let's move on to today's topic. For many, there's a moment in grief when you realize that the experience is much bigger than you. You realize grief can't be bottled up. It can't be avoided or even controlled. You realize that grief is better served by befriending it, giving it space to better understand, and expressing it by sharing it with other people who won't judge you for feeling the way you feel. And then there's trauma. Trauma breaks trust. It breaks trust with people, the world, nature, and sometimes even a higher power. On today's Grief Refuge podcast, the author and speaker Bill Jenkins shares what he's come to know about traumatic loss and how it changes relationships. Bill offers a ton of insight for how to work through a traumatic loss while deeply grieving. Bill also shares his personal experience regarding the tragic and traumatic loss of his son William. My deepest gratitude and special thanks to Bill for sharing his knowledge and his personal experience. Please enjoy our conversation. All right. Hi, everybody. We're here with Bill Jenkins, and we're here to talk about a really important topic. And it's really about how relationships do change after traumatic loss. And so, Bill, welcome to Grief Refuge.
Thank you, Reed. It's a pleasure being here.
Very happy to have you here. Very looking forward to learning more from you and your personal experience. Got a lot of questions lined up for you. Did a little bit of homework and,
Good for
looking
you.
forward to this awesome conversation. I love learning from my guests on the Grief Refuge podcast and appreciate your time here.
Oh, well, I'm just happy to be able to come and share with you and your audience. It's a real pleasure to be able to do this, sharing what I have been through with the possibility that it might help other people is really what makes a lot of this bearable and important to me.
Awesome. Okay. Bill, when I was doing my homework, I was really drawn to some of the concept of traumatic loss. And I'll be very transparent. I'm kind of sitting here at the time of our recording, it's February of 2022, and I'm kind of sitting here just starting to feel a little bit in my own skin, a little bit desensitized to the word traumatic because I'm hearing it more and more frequently. Now, I don't want to dismiss it because I still honor it. I still have a high sensitivity to it. But I feel like I don't know why. Perhaps it's in media, perhaps it's in daily conversations. Well, perhaps it's because I'm trained in psychology. My wife's also a psychologist. We talk about trauma a lot. And so it's really got me thinking for quite a while where it's like, well, what isn't a trauma? And so, Bill, I really wanted to, I guess, define our terms first as we start this conversation.
Absolutely.
And first ask you, for you, in your experience, Bill, how do you distinguish traumatic loss from other types of loss?
Well, I think first we have to go back to the clinical definition of trauma. It has become popularized. It has crept into popular culture, which is not surprising with a concept like this. And I will certainly not say that it should be minimized or dismissed at all, ever. But there are a couple things we need to remember about trauma. In the classic definition, trauma is basically it's the Greek word for wound, which is a good place to start. It's a wounding. But it goes beyond that when we talk about it in the legal sense and in the clinical sense and hospital situations. Trauma is a life threat. It is an event that threatens you physically. It could be sexual assault. But it also could be a physical assault from an attacker. It could be a car crash. It could be, in my case, it was my child was killed, and that upset my life to the point where I am a trauma survivor because of the impact that all had on me. So when we look at it in those terms, then it is a very, very serious impact from external forces on our lives that threaten our lives, threatened our well-being, threaten our safety. Now, that said, trauma also exists on a spectrum. So, and the other part of this is that trauma really can only be evaluated from the level of the person who is traumatized. There are people who have experienced events in their lives that other people would not think of them as traumatic. When I do workshops, I always ask people to raise their hand if they've been traumatized riding in the front seat of a roller coaster because because their teenager talked them into it, and about half the hands go up. But for the teenager who talked them into it, it was fun. It was exhilarating. It was an exciting moment, and it was also a chance to laugh at mom. But the difference between those two is that one person in that seat felt safe doing it, and that was a teen. And the other in the seat, the mom or the person who was being traumatized, did not feel safe. And that really is where we begin to identify what a trauma stressor is, your ability to feel safe in the moment. If you or I'm going to assume this about you, I know it about me. If you and I were taken to the airport and plopped down in the seat of a jet and said, okay, we're going to do some takeoffs and landings now, we'd be pretty traumatized and figure, okay, we're all going to die. Because we're not ready for that. We're not trained. We're not prepared. We haven't had any preparation to be able to deal with that. So it's outside of what we call our window of tolerance, the things that we can manage to do, even if they're a little difficult sometimes. But for an airline pilot that does a couple of these every day, it's not an issue. So, and this is one of the problems we run into when we start talking about trauma as a popular concept, and it's basically we start judging other people's traumas and saying, well, that can't be traumatizing for you. I can't see how that was traumatizing for you. The death of your dog, really? But yes, the death of someone's dog can be extremely traumatizing, and it's all about relationships, what your relationship to that person or that thing was. It's all about the amount of injury that is actually committed or the amount of injury that is perceived. And trauma for many of us is kind of the province of close calls. There are a lot of people who barely survive an incident and they truly thought they would die, and they didn't. And when your brain wakes up and realizes, wow, I'm still alive, how did that happen? But it had gone through the entire process of being afraid, having a gut feeling something's wrong, and then saying, oh my gosh, I got to get out of here, and trying to run but couldn't get away, and then was either trapped or captured and had to fight their way out of it, and then they couldn't. And then they realized, okay, there's no way to win. And so you descend into a level of helplessness and dissociation, which when you're being sexually assaulted can be very insidious because people don't have to kill us to get what they want from us. And then afterwards, you realize I'm alive, and now what do I do? So, and this is where we start dealing with issues like PTSD and post-traumatic stress and acute stress disorders and all of those other things that they've tried to slice and dice the diagnoses in order to help identify just exactly what behaviors to expect from people and how to best treat them. But this is where the living after trauma has such a powerful impact on us. And it could be, from some people's perspective, it could be fairly innocuous. From somebody else's perspective, it can be earth-shattering. And so one of the important things to remember about trauma is that it is something that can only be judged by the perspective of the person who is going through that experience.
And quite similar to grief, actually, there was a few aha moments in your explanation, which was a very great overview and helped for a deeper understanding. Thank you for that. I actually was,
Sure.
In my thoughts, I was like, oh, how interesting. Grief can be so disenfranchised, and yet so can trauma. And I've never really thought about that before. I've never even heard the terms disenfranchised trauma, but yet it's so possible. And you clearly helped us understand, how that does happen on a more common experience. Bill, you're firing out of the gates here.
Well, let me give you something else to think and chew on here. Grief is always associated with loss. Trauma is not always associated with loss, but is commonly associated with some type of loss, whether it's loss of capability, loss of innocence, loss of life, loss of limb. But grief is associated with loss. Trauma and trauma recovery are associated to learn how to live in safety again. So the two processes, because grief is a process of recovery and adaptation to get used to the fact that my son isn't going to be at the dining room table anymore. You have to learn to adapt to that, and it is certainly something that accompaniment and reliable relationships with other people can help with dramatically. But so is trauma. I had a friend recently whose son was killed, and it was a horrific experience for him and his family. And one of the best pieces of advice I felt I could give him was that it's very important when you are working with trauma and trauma recovery to deal with the trauma first. And then you'll find that you'll be able to deal with the grief in a much more effective way. Because grief is a typical and natural and often occurring process in our brains. It's something that it does every time we lose a pet, or every time we lose a job, or every time we lose a relationship, we are going to go through a process of grief and readaptation. But trauma adds to that and makes it harder because we've also lost our sense of safety. And it only should happen extremely rarely, maybe once, twice. I mean, I have had one major traumatic stressor in my life, and that was the death of my son. So it's going to have much more infrequently. So the trauma has to be dealt with first, so that the job that our brains know they need to do with regards to dealing with the loss can take place. Because if we're not feeling safe, if we're not feeling like we are in a place where we can sit back, relax, and do that work that we need to do on the grief side, the grief side isn't going to be able to do anything. It's very, very difficult to relax when you are not feeling safe in your environment, whatever that environment is. So it's terribly important to resolve the issues that are associated with the trauma first. And when you've done that, then you can sit down and really start to grieve in a way that your brain knows how to do and knows what it needs to do.
Bill, you sound very knowledgeable, and you've mentioned the death of your son a couple times, mm-hmm. And I guess I assume that this knowledge of trauma, relationships, and grief and loss, it's not something that you do every day professionally, correct?
That's great. I don't think that I could do this work, at least not where I am now. Once you become a trauma survivor, it enables you to help trauma survivors, but not in the same way a therapist can, because we're no longer objective. So even though being a trauma survivor can bring a lot of amazing resources to the table when working with others and working with this kind of population, it's very, very hard to be objective. That doesn't mean that there aren't some amazing therapists out there that were therapists before they were traumatized. There was one in Richmond, Virginia, where my son was when my son was killed. His son had been killed in an incident downtown, and he was a psychotherapist. And one of the things that he realized was, wow, here's a whole new calling for me, because now I know what it feels like. And he became one of the most sought after grief therapists in the area, because it made him a better therapist. Me, I'm not so sure. I'm more on the educator side and teaching other people about trauma by virtue of my experience. I am a college professor for the last 30 years or so. I actually started off in the theater, in the arts, working, doing some acting from time to time. But what I was really found I was good at was designing scenery and lighting and solving problems backstage and things like that, making other people look good. Getting up in front of talking to people is what I do well. And after this happened to me, one of the things that I realized was I don't want any more bad things to happen because of this event. And so I set out to do what I call redeeming the tragedy. And one of those things was to learn as much about what I was going through as possible. And when you're a teacher going through something like this, oftentimes it's very difficult to not take notes. And so I took notes. And what I finally wound up with, and I did a lot of research, and I bought a lot of books, including Dr. Wolfeld's book. It wound up turning into a pile of materials that I could either just put in my desk after I was kind of moving on from where I was, or I could write the book that I hadn't been able to find, which was a book about grief and loss from the perspective of the victim and the survivor. And that's when I sat down and wrote What to Do When the Police Leave, a guide to the first day as a traumatic loss. And it's helped tens of thousands of people, as far as I can tell. and it has been an extraordinary experience, and it has given me the opportunity to speak at national conferences of organizations like Parents Who Murdered Children, National Organization of Victim Assistance, and ultimately, I'm now teaching a course in trauma-informed care for the graduate program at the school where I teach at, Dominican University near Chicago, in our new trauma-informed leadership master's degree. So I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for what happened to me, but I swear to you, I would give up a couple of limbs and a couple of non-essential organs to have William back, and to have never had to go through it in the first place.
Really appreciate that, Bill. Turning trauma and tragedy into being of service of others. You've got a good mind and a good heart for that. I just feel called, if you're willing to. Can you tell us a bit about William?
Sure. William was 16 years old at the time he was killed. He was 1 month shy of his 17th birthday. So he was an old 16, not a young 16, if you understand the difference there. I'm sure a lot of parents will. He was a good kid, solid friend to his friends, and reliable, artistic. He was a great musician. We would go to music stores and go around and play, all the guitars together and stuff like that. And he also did some writing, and he was just really coming into his own, discovering what it was that he was good at and what he wanted to be with his life. He was on his second day at work at a fast food restaurant in Richmond, Virginia, but not in the city, but out in the western suburbs where things were supposed to be pretty safe. He was on his second day at work. He had just gotten hired. And a young man had asked him on his first day of work if he wouldn't mind switching the shifts with him on his next day, so the other guy could go on a date with his girlfriend. And William was just the kind of kid was like, yeah, sure, I'll help out. I'll do whatever you need. And so the next day rolled around. I drove William to the library in the morning, so he'd have some things to do during the day to get ready for school. And this was in August of 1997. And that evening, I got a phone call from a police officer. I was not living with William and his mom. We had divorced a number of years before. But the police were at William and his mom's place, and they called me and said, could you come over? And I said, okay. Can you tell me what this is about? And they said, no, sir, I'm afraid we can't. It's just, once you come on over and please drive safe. And I said, sure, I'll be there in 10 minutes. And I was there in 10 minutes. And on the way over, I was thinking, well, why didn't the police officer reassure me that William was okay? I mean, sometimes you just start asking questions that don't have answers. And then I realized, well, if he had assured me that he was okay and that he was just in really, really big trouble and we needed to have a chat, he would have said that. If he had reassured me that William was okay, but he was in the hospital, or he wasn't okay, but he was in the hospital, he would have told me that, and we would be meeting at the hospital. And so I had pretty much figured by the time I got to William's house that there was as much in what the police officer didn't say as much as there was in what he did say. And I had figured this was going to be a bad situation. I walked up the front door. The police officer answered the door and welcomed me in. I went in, looked to the left, and there was William's mom sitting on the sofa with a woman I didn't know, who turns out to be from the mental health program that they basically sent a very small crisis response team of 2 people, one from mental health and one police officer. And I came in and he introduced himself. I said, hi, I'm Officer. I don't remember his last name, but that's not surprising. And I said, I looked right at him, and I think I kind of surprised him. I said, is this something I should be sitting down for? And he said, yes, sir, I think it is. So I sat down, and then he proceeded to tell me that William had been shot and killed while working at the fast food restaurant while he was on his second day at work. It had happened around 10:30 in the evening, but they had been unable to make a confirmation of his identity right away, because Big Goof didn't take his driver's license with him, didn't have any ID on him. So they wanted to make sure they absolutely had the right kid, which was the absolute right thing to do. Turns out that the restaurant had been robbed at closing time around 10:30 by a 23-year-old man and two accomplices. One was a 17-year-old girl, and the other was an 18-year-old girl. And the girls had come up and tried to, see how many people were inside. I got to remember, this was it's important to know that this was a restaurant that was a local private chain. It was built a lot like, if you've ever seen the Sonic or the Checkers restaurants that are just basically a big cardboard box, or not cardboard, a big concrete box set down on a slab, and you order at the front window, and then you take your food away, or you order at the drive-through and take your food with you. So it wasn't like a regular restaurant with eat-in dining and all of that. So, but William had taken the trash out. The manager was the only person left inside, and she had asked him to take the trash out, and then she would go ahead and turn on the alarm and lock up. I know what William was doing. He was sticking around just to make sure she was going to be okay, because that's just the kind of guy he was. He goes out the door with the trash bag. It was a man standing off to the side. By this time, the man had come up from behind the restaurant where they'd parked, grabbed William from behind, put the gun up to his neck, and said, open the door. And William did everything we tell people to do when you have this kind of situation. He cooperated completely, didn't escalate the situation. He realized best thing to do is knock on the door, get the manager to open up, and even though that's a dangerous thing, it was the best way out. Just give the guy what he wants and let him get the money. And so when William knocked on the door, and the manager looked through the peephole in the door, and William said, you have to open the door. And she realized what was going on, and of course she wanted to cooperate and make sure that this was going to go as well as possible. She unlocked the door and opened it so the man could get in. And at that point, for whatever reason, we still don't know why, the man fired the gun, and the bullet went through William's neck and killed him instantly. From that point on, the man forced the manager to open the safe. She completely thought she was going to be next. All of her fine motor skills, not surprisingly, went out the window. Took her 5 tries to open the safe, and every time she failed, she thought she was just going to get a bullet in the back of the head. She finally got the safe open. The man took $1,700 out of the safe. Didn't have anything to carry all of this stuff in, because now his hands were full, so he grabbed the manager's purse and put the gun and the money in the purse. Ran out the door, jumped over William's body, ran out the door down to where they had the car waiting with the 2 girls, jumped in, and they all drove off away from the building. Well, while all this was happening inside, there was another young man who had left the restaurant and left the back through the back door before this guy had come up to it. And so he was standing on the other side of the building next to the payphone, waiting for his mom to pick him up, and heard the gunshot and heard the manager scream, and he realized there's something really bad going on. So he went to the payphone that was hanging on the side of the building, called 911. Dispatch went out. There was a police officer literally across the street in a used car parking lot, just sitting there doing some paperwork, with the windows up and the air conditioning on, because it's Richmond in August, so it was pretty warm. So he didn't hear what was going on, but he came out, and as he was coming down the street at the corner of where the restaurant was located, he saw a car pull out and drive away at what they call a high rate of speed. So he followed the car and apprehended them about 5 minutes later, when they wound up in a cul-de-sac in a set of apartments down behind the building. They took a wrong turn, wound up getting caught. The 2 girls basically said, we had no idea this was going to happen. They testified. The man was caught with the money from the restaurant, the gun from the gun that did the murder, and the manager's purse. So it's kind of a pretty open and shut case, and just a total waste of a human life.
It is a tragedy. If you're okay with me saying that. And
absolutely, you are absolutely correct. It is a true tragedy. People you care about die. Being in the theater, I know these kinds of things. But yeah, that's how we define tragedy. In a show, the people that you care about the most are the ones that get killed. Hamlet, King Lear, all those guys.
And in my projection, it would probably take me a full lifetime to make peace with the tragedy as such.
Well, and it is. It is taking me a whole lifetime. This was 1997. It's over 20, coming up on 25 years now, and it has taken that long, and it will continue to follow me for the rest of my life. Although the way that I'm dealing with it now is very different from the way that I dealt with it in the first weeks, months, and even years following. It was tough going for a while, and as I gained more resilience, as I relied on the help of good, reliable friends, as I lost friends that really didn't want to be associated with a murder victim, I gained new ones who were themselves murder victims and very nice people. And we had a good, solid grief support group at our local courthouse run by the Victim Assistance Program. We went through the trials, 3 guilty verdicts. The man was brought up on capital murder. And just an incidental to all of this, I've always been a lifelong opponent of the death penalty, and now I had to basically decide what side of the fence I really came down on, and we actually told the prosecutor we didn't want the death penalty for this case because we didn't feel that it would aid our healing. We didn't feel that the process would be good for us, and I think we made the right decision there. Other victims' families may make a different decision, but this was the one we made, and we have continued to move forward, and there have been a lot of wonderful things that have happened as a result of the tragedy entering in our lives and us trying to redeem it. And there are a lot of sad and regrettable things that have happened as well that are all part of life amplified, I guess, by trauma. The highs are higher, the lows are lower. And it really does seem to be very difficult to keep an even keel throughout the day.
Mm. I feel a bit naive asking this, but in your experience, is it once a trauma, always a trauma?
Well, I've been doing a lot of studying on this as I prepare to teach a class in it, and as I prepare to do workshops in it. What I generally talk about is the idea that we can recover from trauma, but we need to rethink it. We need to not keep trying to call it recovery like I recovered from a broken arm that I had when I was a kid. It's more of a reassembly. You see all of these pieces on the ground in when the vase is broken, and you got to put them all back together. And when you do, if you have all the pieces, it will resemble a vase again. It'll even start to function as a vase again. And in the Japanese tradition, it's kind of interesting. They have a tradition called kintsu kuroi, which I actually use pictures of some of these in my workshops at the end. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but it's a fascinating little concept. But when you break a vase or a piece of pottery, you take it to this craftsperson who then glues everything back together with gold and silver infused lacquer, so that when you put it back together, it's got a spider web of lines of precious metal in it. And it's brought back with great ceremony, and it is considered more valuable and more beautiful because it was broken and it went through the process of being broken and then reassembled. And it's not put off in the corner so that nobody sees that it was put back together with crazy glue, like in our culture, right? It's put in the center of the table. It's put on display because it is more precious, having been broken and restored. And I think it's a great metaphor for trauma recovery, or trauma reassembly, I guess you might say. But the problem that we have is that, according to certain statistics, very reputable ones, about 90% of our population has experienced a trauma that qualifies as a life-threatening event or a severely destabilizing event in our lives. About 90%. And I don't know whether you're familiar with the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was done back in 1998 by Dr. Anda and Dr. Felitti, which is a fascinating study, and I'm not going to go into it, but you can look it up online. About 60% of our population has had multiple adverse childhood experiences. And yet, when you look at the number of people that are actually diagnosed with PTSD, and of course, there are some people that never get diagnosed because they never seek a diagnosis or seek a treatment, but it's only runs about 10% for the general population. Now, of course, that's higher with certain populations like combat veterans or domestic abuse survivors, things like that. But it's about 10% across the population. So that does mean from the 90 down to the 10 that there are a lot of people who are able to restore their lives, recover, if you will, have the trauma begin to abate and the impact of it begin to fall away. Now, it's not just time that does that. I don't believe the old saying that time heals all wounds. It's not just time. It's time plus a sense of purpose, a sense of safety throughout your life and living in chronic safety from that point on, solid relationships, and some good therapy. You add all those together and you're going to get some sense of improvement and better outcomes. Now, not everybody does that formally. A lot of people all of those things just sort of fall together in their lives and it works out. They've got supportive families, things like that. But we do and can get better from traumatic events. And the 10% that doesn't are typically people that have endured such enormous traumatic stressors, repeated over time, very, very high demand on their lives with very, very low sense of control. And for them, trauma, post-trauma stress disorder, if you want to call it that, the way they do in the diagnosis, is going to continue for them until they can work through all of it. And that can take a lot of time. But if you're dealing with an acute stress or a single trauma or short-term issues, we do get better because our brains have the ability to adapt and to change perception and turn the corner from being a victim to being a victor. And so to that extent, yes, we do get better. Now, here's the problem. We may no longer qualify for post-traumatic diagnosis, but we probably still carry the shadows around with us. There are a lot of people wandering around the earth and in our population today that are certainly carrying around the shadows of trauma, even though they are still destabilizing. They are still difficult for them to deal with. They still may provoke them to anger or to fleeing a crisis in a difficult situation when stressors get along, or angry outbursts that they used to not have. But at the same time, they're not debilitating and rising to that level. And so in many respects, we've got a lot of people in our society today that are exhibiting the same behaviors that you would have for someone who has been deeply traumatized: the avoidant behaviors, the sleeplessness, the fleeing, the fighting, and overall sense of helplessness, perhaps, strong sense of self-preservation, being extremely sensitive to threats rather than being able to let things go. We're seeing this in our society today. So, stress needs to be reduced. The more that our stress in our society and in our daily lives is reduced, the better chance we will have of being able to return to a trusting, empathetic, caring, and cooperative, not just individual, but also as society.
Bill, what are some ways you reduced your traumatic stress?
Well, first thing I did was I recognized that, and even though I didn't have somebody to tell me this, I recognized I couldn't do it myself. And it is important to have good therapy, trauma-informed therapy, I might add. Don't just go to a therapist who helps people with their divorces a lot, and their teenagers acting out. I mean, it needs to be a trauma-informed therapist who knows how to address the deep-seated nature of trauma. Trauma has an effect on us throughout every single physical and mental bodily system. Throughout everything in our brain that makes us human, throughout everything in our body that enables us to function and keep us alive. And because it attacks our sense of safety, which is linked to our autonomic nervous system, which is linked to our crisis response. And so oftentimes people will wind up after trauma, for example, one of these shadows in their lives might be hypervigilance, and they're constantly looking over their shoulders and they're not really ever feeling safe, whether they're walking down the street or maybe not even sitting in their offices because it's a noisy environment or lots of loud noises, or maybe a couple of coworkers that are kind of a little sketchy and they don't really trust them. And it doesn't take much to increase that level of adrenaline and cortisol in their systems, and they feel uneasy. They're always looking out for threat, and they start at a high level and they go up from there. And as a result, you need to deal with that. You need to address that. And the first thing you have to do is you have to learn to feel safe, and you have to learn to notice safety. And this is where the mindfulness meditations come in. When you are actually able to notice your surroundings and rest your autonomic nervous system and notice, wow, I really am very safe right now. When you're able to walk down the street and look around and realize, look at all these wonderful people out Christmas shopping, right? And see the positive side of that, as opposed to, oh my gosh, there's a crowd of people that I have no idea who any of these people are. And I just don't feel safe here. Judith Herman, in her book Trauma Recovery, just a very one of the first books that was ever written about this, clinically, and still one of the best, talks about the concept of trauma being a constrictor in our lives. The more things we become afraid of, the more things we will avoid, because avoidance is one of the hallmarks of trauma symptomology. And I should probably mention at this point that trauma symptoms, I think, have been looked at primarily as symptoms. And coming from the psychology world, you probably have been taught that there are symptoms to trauma. You have the avoidance, you have the rumination, you have the intrusive thoughts and dreams, and all of these other things that the instability in personalities. But one of the things we have to remember is that these are not necessarily symptoms as much as they are attempts to cope. And that whole thing about avoidance, it works real well if you're a Katrina survivor and you move to Colorado, right? You've avoided hurricanes completely. Now, might have an avalanche or two, but the whole point is sometimes avoidance works. The problem occurs for most people in trauma who are dealing with ongoing issues is that they can't escape. They still have to live in the family that is pushing all their buttons. They still have to live in a neighborhood where they hear gunshots every night after their child is killed. And that's where trauma begins to compound on top of itself. When you can't exercise these coping strategies effectively, then they do become destabilizing and no longer helpful. So to answer your question, the things that help are accompaniment, good, solid, stable, rock solid relationships that you can trust, because trauma breaks trust with people, breaks trust with the world, breaks trust with nature, breaks trust with God. You have to surround yourself with good, solid relationships that can help you through this. You need to look for ways to find purpose in what you have been through, and how you can then perhaps help other people. A lot of people will start working on rape crisis hotlines, or a lot of people will start working as victim advocates or volunteering, or doing any number of things that will have some even go and work with prisoners because they realize that's perhaps the best way to prevent future victimization, is to make sure that people aren't going to become recidivist offenders and go back into prison after committing another crime and creating another victim. So let's go teach them to read. Let's go teach them some art skills. Let's go teach them social skills. Let's go and sit and talk about forgiveness and how to manage your social involvements and altercations. So there are a number of things that we can do, but and the thing is, and I think where a lot of treatment up to this point has fallen short, is they don't realize that there's no silver bullet, if you forgive the expression. There's no magic bullet. There's no one size fits all treatment for depression or post-trauma symptoms or any number of these other things, because they're all caused by different kinds of problems and different kinds of traumas. Many of the things that we look at as mental illness today, I look at and say, oh, well, there's probably trauma at the bottom of that. Because trauma can be a great chameleon. And you can walk in with a lot of symptoms and you are maybe passive aggressive, or you are obsessive compulsive, or you have dissociative identity disorder. And if you do a really good trauma history, you start uncovering things from childhood or sexual assault at the age of 4. And you can't figure out why this child is not behaving well in school. Well, living in an abusive family for the first 6 years of your life does not develop the adaptive, cooperative skills and trusting skills that you need to be able to use when you go into a classroom of 30 kids that are 6 years old with a teacher who wants you to listen to her. So, there's a lot of complexity to this. So we need to make sure that we're treating people for a one size fits one. You might get one size fits a couple, but it's got to be one size fits one. You've got to get to the bottom of what's going on with this person, how has trauma impacted them, and are there any shadows left over from some of these early traumas that are impacting their lives now. And you can't do that without trust. You can't do that without developing a relationship with someone that you are able to really speak to honestly. And you can't do that without good, solid information from family members, and some of whom might not be willing to share some of the things that happened to the child when they were 4, 5, 6 years old. So it is difficult, but we can't just treat the symptoms, because the symptoms aren't symptoms. The symptoms are strategies for trying to survive. And once you get past that, then a lot of human behavior starts making sense.
Thank you, Bill. It's all very insightful. Keep getting more validation of just how much you've come to learn to understand these experiences, and then also draw in your own. So I almost feel like you're my new encyclopedia of grief and trauma. and now I
don't tell Dr. Wolfout that, okay?
Right. If I have more questions, I'm going to contact Bill Jenkins. And so there actually are a lot.
Come take my class.
Right. You might see me as a student in your class for sure. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit because you did. Sure. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the note-taking, and that being a part of who you are and your personality, and also I'm assuming a way to cope, or one of the ways to cope. And so that note-taking led to authoring of a book, and the book is called What to Do After the Police Leave. Bill, I'm so curious if you would share an important message from your book, Sure. What to Do After the Police Leave.
Well, I'm most proud of the fact that people are reading it. I've had people come up to me. This is it for those of the might be interested in looking at it. People are reading it. They're getting something out of it. I had a woman come up to me at a reception once after a conference, and she said, my book saved her life. Well, that can really make an author feel very humble. We started off giving good practical advice, and I actually couldn't find a publisher. I had to do this myself. I had to publish myself because I went to several publishers, and I kept getting comments like, well, there are already plenty of books about that. Well, first of all, they're not. And then the other problem was they thought I was writing my story, which I wasn't. And unless you are, a high-profile victim of crime and homicide, nobody really wants to read your story. Well, I get that. And that's why I'm not writing my story. I am writing all of the information that I wish I had the night that my son was killed in my hands. So I didn't have to go looking for it. And as a result, I sat down, I wrote it, self-published it because I had to be the little red hen. And ultimately, it's now being used by victim advocacy programs, being used by police departments to use as a death notification tool. It is being used for training, and it's being used by victims to sit down and read and say, wow, this is why I feel this way, and this is what's going on in the police and criminal justice system while I'm sitting here at home waiting for them to call. And this is what grief and grieving is all about. I did put a couple of journal notes in here, and let me just read one of them to you. This is the one that I put at because I would write journals and and also write to other people, and some of those found their way into the book. But this is the one that I wrote at the beginning of Grief and Grieving. Don't be afraid to remember him in loving and positive ways. His face is in the clouds and his smile is in the sunshine. I often see things that bring a sad smile or a tear when they remind me of him. But perhaps the best thing to do with an empty heart is to fill it up with tears. So little inspirational things like that. And we start off with the very basics. How to plan a funeral on short notice for somebody that you didn't expect to die. What happens when we grieve, how to talk to the children in the family. And all of these things we learned from going through it ourselves and figuring out, sometimes the hard way, what worked and what didn't. Then I expanded on that as I was working with our victim advocates and they were helping us through the process, and some of the other folks in the homicide support group that gave me encouragement and wouldn't let me stop after I told them that I had started. So one of those things I learned very quickly, don't ever tell anybody you're writing a book, because what's going to happen is about 6 months later, they're going to ask, so how's that book coming? And it's like, well, I kind of put it away because it was just getting to be too much. And they say, oh no, you can't do that. You got to write this book. So they forced me, they bullied me into finishing it. But now that I have, I'm grateful that it's doing so much good out there. And now there are some other victims that have written books that are very similar. And one friend of mine has written a book it's a workbook for victims. And so there's Connie Sadin, and she's it's a wonderful book. And so there are more people out there who are starting to do this. And now, as opposed to walking into the bookstore and not being able to find anything from the victims, and instead you're just seeing things written by doctors and nurses and clinicians. And the one exception to that is Janice Harris Lord's book, No Time for Goodbyes, because she really put herself in the place of the victims, and in addition had access to victims of drunk driving crashes from her work with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And yet, at the same time, it's about drunk driving. So, I mean, she tried to make it as general as possible. And to her credit, she put in a lot of victim stories, case studies, kind of things, but in their words, which was superb. And I'm good friends with her, and I have the greatest respect for the work she did. And basically, she just laid some groundwork for me to come along later as a victim whose voice is through the whole book, as we are going through this, and this is how we can help ourselves and things like that. So it's a different kind of book, and but it has helped a lot of people, and I'll be eternally grateful for that.
I'm very grateful that you wrote the book. I think it's an extremely important resource to, unfortunately, people experiencing their own personal tragedies. Bill, I want to thank you for your time, your knowledge, the honoring of William, and everything that you've shared with us on Grief Refuge today.
Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed the process, Reed, and hope we can do this again sometime.
Thank you so much for listening to the full interview. I'm deeply grateful for your trust in Grief Refuge and the experiences shared here. This is important work, and although painful at times, it's worth it for helping you heal your heart, your mind, and your soul. Remember that if you need more support, you can get more stories, guidance, insights, and daily messages of grief support on the Grief Refuge app, which I hope you download from your phone's app store now. Thank you, take care, keep honoring your grief, and listening to your heart. Be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.